Welcome back to Run Walk Talk, Tales of Inclusion and Development. I'm Steph, my pronouns are she and her, and I'm here with Judy, her pronouns are she and her. And today we are really thrilled to welcome two special guests with us, Tina Balachandran and Prachi Jatania. And they're both from Immigrant Women's Initiative. Judy, why don't you take a minute to introduce our guests before we dive into the questions?
Sounds great. Thanks, Steph. And so today, as Steph mentioned, we're going to be talking about the Immigrant Women's Initiative, what it is, why it matters, and the real experiences of immigrant women building lives and also leading in Canada. Tina is a community leader and social impact strategist serving as the senior manager, equity and community engagement at DIVERSEcity Community Resources Society, where she leads newcomer integration, inclusive community development, and cross-sector partnerships. And we also welcome Prachi, who is an award-winning multimedia journalist and social impact leader with over 20 years of experience in strategic communications, storytelling, and brand building, and currently heading the communications and media portfolio at the UBC Sauder School of Business across Canada and also in 12 plus international markets. Prachi and Tina are also the co-founders of Immigrant Women's Initiative, which is a network supporting immigrant women professionals and entrepreneurs through mentorship, storytelling, and leadership development. And we are very much looking forward to our conversation with you both today.
Thanks for being with us. So why don't we get into the very first question of the sort of the big why that you probably get all the time is, why did you start Immigrant Women's Initiative? And like, how did you get started? Share it, maybe Tina, you can start and share sort of the backstory.
Absolutely. Thank you, Judy and Stephanie, for having us here. It's a real pleasure and an honor, and we are very excited to have this conversation with all your listeners. So IWI, Immigrant Women Initiative, grew out of our own lived experiences as immigrant women navigating our professional lives here in Canada. Prachi and I both were meeting women from across the globe, hearing stories where women, much like us, had years of experience, global experience, qualification, talent, skills, everything that the Canadian labor market could leverage. And yet they were shrinking, they were settling in, and their skill sets and their qualifications were not optimized. So there was clearly a huge gap, and it was also a huge loss. So systemic barriers and biases limit opportunities. And here it wasn't about their competence or confidence or capabilities. It was more about the systems not leveraging the talent that they had. So we decided the spaces that we craved for when we first arrived as immigrant women to build those. And thus was the kind of, birth story of Immigrant Women Initiative, a network that we decided to put together where women don't have to explain their ambition, they don't have to shrink, they come together, learn from each other, share resources, mentorship, advocacy, self-advocacy, and also get inspired by other women leaders and, explore their professional and entrepreneurial journeys to lead to their full potential. I will let Prachi add something that I may not have added or would like to sort of embellish something.
Thanks, Tina. And so nice to be in community and share the space with you, Judy and Steph. Thanks for having us on this conversation. To add to what Tina said and to expand, what we did when we first began getting a lot of interaction, outreach from other women of color, from immigrants and newcomer women, was we had a pilot. We had gatherings, we created opportunities and built connections. And through those initial conversations and grassroots engagements, we recognized that we did not want a cookie cutter approach to integration, assimilation, and settlement of women of color, immigrant women, and newcomers in the Canadian economy. We wanted a more tailored, more personalized, more curated, more humane approach, and that's what actually prompted us and motivated us to formalize an informal gathering of sorts into what is the Immigrant Women Initiative. The original motivation and incentive was because we ourselves were craving those connections, that sense of belonging, and a community or a shared space that is safe, that's welcoming, and that is truly inclusive. Because we were seeing so many other women facing similar barriers and challenges because they were just surviving in the Canadian economy, in the Canadian workplace. They weren't necessarily always thriving. And if they were thriving, they were reaching out to us to say, how can we give back? We had stories and multiple conversations with women who were even second generation immigrants who had seen their mothers navigate these challenges and face these barriers. And they reached out to us saying, what can I do? What can I do to actually help other women rise, bring them along this journey and not face those barriers that my mother did, or that I saw my family navigate when they first arrived here? And using those initial conversations and that pilot, we formalized the Immigrant Women Initiative to support a career advancement, to help women actually lean on each other and find those mentors, those advocates, those allies in a more formalized structure and have a sense of meaningful, purposeful connection.
What an amazing community you've built. It would be interesting to hear, what are some of the invisible challenges that immigrant women face that people who were born in Canada might not even realize? Maybe Prachi, we'll start with you.
Tina touched upon this. We recognize that there's been a lot of work. Canada leads in the recognition of and creation of the immigration system, a points-based immigration system, and a lot of work has been done in the many decades prior. And we don't want necessarily to dilute or critique any of it. What we wanted to do was have a more tailored approach. The barriers that women, when they first arrive or when they are in the workplace, is that their credentials are not recognized. They're diluting their prior or pre-arrival to the Canadian workplace experience. They are all very established. They have skills that either need upskilling, reskilling, or they need to be able to adapt and actually recognize what is it that the Canadian workplace, the Canadian labor market actually needs. What are the problems that I can address with my prior experience? A lot of this rewriting of one's narrative from already having a lot of prior work experience was what we were ourselves facing, because finding a job is one step as a newcomer, as an immigrant woman. But what is important, the second step and the steps after, is to actually succeed in your roles, to be able to find those sponsors within your workplaces or in your business who can actually take you along a journey that really makes you feel like you belong, that I own this space, that this was a room that I created and that I can be a part of, and to bring their fullest potentials and to be recognized for all of their skill sets. So there are a lot of continued barriers. These are unseen, unspoken, especially for women who may not necessarily be in professions that are regulated necessarily. They don't necessarily always, as a first step, when they find an employer or a job opportunity or a business opportunity, need to necessarily reskill. They may need to upskill once they are in that workplace or that business, but they don't necessarily need to rewrite or shrink themselves or actually dilute their resumes. They already come with a lot of experience, skill sets, and expertise that is valuable to the Canadian economy, to the Canadian job market. But a lot of employers and recruiters, and all of this is very unspoken, is that they hesitate. They always ask, do you really bring Canadian work experience? And so much so that eventually a lot of other provinces outside BC have had to remove that unspoken, that unseen barrier of asking for Canadian work experience. Because remember, a lot of these women professionals, business owners already have years of experience. They have a very established, successful resume that they come with, and they don't want to be silently just be in the background, in the shadows. They want to contribute to the Canadian economy.
Of course. No, thank you for that. And Tina, did you have anything to add?
So Prachi touched upon some of the stuff that is, the visible and the invisible kind of, barriers and the obvious that we see when it comes to credentials, when it comes to language. There is also something which is, the expectation to settle quietly. A lot of times we are seeing that the women are coming from backgrounds, cultures where the nuance of the women's leadership or women in their professional space is not so kind of, defined. They are not used to putting themselves first or advocating for themselves. And what we're also seeing is that when you're so busy coming in as an immigrant and settling in your family, we've heard stories and come across women, they've had to kind of put their career journey or their growth on the back burner because they need to support the spouse in many cases, whether or not they are the primary caregivers. So what happens a lot of times in that, kind of, pathway where you're settling in the family, you're a caregiver, you're letting your spouse lead sort of, their career aspirations, you are isolated. You don't have an opportunity to even think about, why this is important. And we already kind of, briefly talked about that. It was almost like everybody we were speaking to, or now that the community is growing, we are hearing not just from this generation, and as Prachi said, second generation settlers as well, who are saying that, we had to constantly explain. We had to constantly tell people why this is important. And we just felt that this was additional work. It was the additional labor of sort of wanting to sort of, show that why this is critical. So they end up kind of, taking that back seat and not focusing on their mentorship, not focusing on building allies, creating those champions, and the agency and confidence is impacted. So oftentimes what we see is just the sort of, surface level, the fact that, okay, these are the skills, this is how they can make the contribution. And we're talking about the barriers to kind of, remove some of those barriers and elevate their pathways. But there are also these hidden sort of, barriers that exist, the settling in that is, do it quietly. You don't need to make a noise. You don't need to ruffle feathers. So we are advocating that, take space and make space. And that's something that immigrant women normally are not very used to hearing. They have what I often like to address it as the triple disadvantage. There is the disadvantage of your gender, there is the disadvantage of your immigration status, and then there is the disadvantage of, the fact that, what is your BIPOC racial identity. So they're constantly trying to navigate the system through one or the other. And these are unseen, which folks don't kind of, tend to notice and see often. They just see, okay, this is it. This is what they want to enter and, do in the labor market.
Tina, that is so interesting. I mean, I have heard the sort of the Canadian experience, stereotype and prejudice and whether you have years of experience, but that settling in quietly is, as you've described it, makes total sense. And then having your community to sort of help support that. So how then have you seen immigrant women go from that simply sort of settling in to leading and shaping their communities? And what does that transition look like?
So I've seen women going from survival, finding jobs, to understanding the system. And as much as skill building is important, understanding the system is also very, very important, to
Right.
actually going and creating programs, leading teams, building businesses. And as you said, the transition piece, Stephanie, the transition comes with a mix of support. Transition comes from self-awareness, self-advocacy, finding the champions and the mentors in the spaces where you are not there, constantly trying to find, the networks that will lift you, networks that will build you up, networks that will help you rise as you are rising. And this is, what we have seen, women who were doing this, receiving this, whether it was mentorship or championship or upskilling or kind of finding their career pathways and building those communities, are now giving back. They are advocating for the voices that are often suppressed and often go unheard. And we have seen multiple examples and stories where they stop asking for permission. They stop asking and they start creating the new world around them. The new world where they don't have to whisper their worth. They are shouting from the rooftop, and they are
Yeah.
owning that space and owning that narrative. And I think that is brilliant. And they're further giving back. I think, the real gift and the real joy of building a network, creating a community, has been the fact that they are not doing it in isolation or doing it alone. It is just so organic to see women stepping up and wanting to lift other women up. When we first started, we thought that we'll have to kind of engineer this in some way or the other, bring in more powerful women, have conversation, have panel discussions, show them the stories of power and strength and contribution. What we are seeing is so organic and beautiful that they are creating and building the space. We are kind of co-designing this. And we
Hmm.
often say this, that, when people ask us, so you came up with that idea of doing an unsummit, an unconventional way of doing leadership forum. You came up with the idea of celebrating women entrepreneurs. So how did you come up with it? And we often, our response, Prachi and my response is that it's not figment of our imagination. We lean into the community. We listen to our peers, our allies, our champions. We have a survey at the end of every engagement, every workshop that we do. The survey keeps getting redesigned because we want to know what women want to do, what they are asking for. And then we try and create and curate those experiences, those learning opportunities, those engagements where they feel that, okay, this is where I am going to be able to lead. I'm going to be able to step in and thrive and walk away with tangible tools and skills, which I'm going to be able to use in the spaces I hold in my professional capacity.
Right. Thank you. Prachi, is there anything that you want to add to that?
For sure. I know that a lot of the co curation, co creation that happens alongside our community members is because they themselves felt that need. They continue to navigate those challenges, or those are shared learnings and journeys they want to bring to the fore, and they also want to be able to become champions themselves. And we often reiterate and reinforce this to the IWI community members, formal, informal cohorts, that we are who we are because of our community. They are the ones actually envisioning this journey alongside us, and they are equal partners because our success cannot be ours alone. It's actually a co creation and co designing of these experiences, these needs, and these spaces that they all want to co create with us hand in hand. Um, We've also seen organically an expectation now from the community wanting advisory, wanting to learn from each other through small business owners. And that was a very natural grassroots need that emerged after a year plus of our engagement. And when we actually gather a lot of women together in IWI engagements, they themselves wanted small business advisories, small business vendor pop-ups and marketplaces to happen. And we are actually fulfilling those needs because this is something that surfaced through our conversations and our touch points with the women in the community. So what really continues to fuel us in this work is hearing these organic voices and these shared experiences come to us and actually co-designing these because it addresses a particular need in their integration and immigration journey as they grow their businesses, if they want to test their products or services, if they want to ideate with another business partner, or they want to be able to learn from each other on their small business journeys. We are actually making that happen alongside them.
Love that.
I do too. And I think that really segues nicely into, for immigrant women who are listening to this podcast and they may be feeling stuck or feeling underestimated, what message or advice would you want to share with them?
Yeah, I love this question because both Tina and I have very much bringing our lived experience lens to actually creating the Immigrant Women Initiative as a platform, a network that is growing organically. Um, what I could actually chime in and say is self advocacy was my biggest learning. And to be able to actually be bring forth my point of view, my perspective, my lived experience, and my experience to every space I hold, to every conversation and engagement I lead. Self advocacy has been my biggest learning. And I know that having a daughter who's a teenager, who's also learning to assimilate and adapt to the different cultural nuances, this is one big learning that I want her to understand and also take away, is to advocate for herself, her needs, her expectations, and also learn to give back once she recognizes that there will be underserved, underrepresented voices in any room, any space that she holds, which is what I do as much as I can in my own capacities. So I would say for any woman, any newcomer, any immigrant woman, whether first generation or somebody who's been here for a very long time, I think the power of self advocacy is something that one must never forget and remind themselves in different points in their journey as women of color, or even as women who want to support each other, lean on each other. Self advocacy has been very powerful. The other point, I think, the other learning and message or a piece of advice that has really helped us in the Immigrant Women Initiative journey is to be able to ask for help, to lean on each other, and to ensure that we are not just silently doing our work. We also want to be able to ask for support, to ask for a sponsor. A lot of us, as newcomers, as immigrants, we do emphasize on finding yourself a mentor when you first arrive here. And after your early transition, I would say a sponsor is critical piece or support who can actually change the trajectory of your career or your business is once you find that sponsor. So ask for these things. And the power of perseverance, I think, because after a certain point in our careers, we tend to overlook what perseverance means and what it's defined and what it shows up as. So I would say self advocacy, asking for help for either a sponsor or a mentor, and persevering, because as we know, the triple disadvantages, but also as the gender we hold as women, we tend to sometimes forget that resilience looks different for different people, but perseverance will support you at every stage of your life and career.
Thank you. Tina, would you like to add?
Yeah, absolutely. And Prachi touched upon, finding mentors, seeking sort of, support from champions and, the self-advocacy and the perseverance. What I want to add to that is, and I want every woman, every immigrant woman, racialized, BIPOC leader, woman to hear this and take this with them, that your experience is your power. Nobody's going to take that away from you. There is no other you. There will be no other you. And I think that's something that we need to own. That's something that we need to find value in. The growth, the progress can be incremental, can be small steps, but celebrate that. I think sometimes what we do is we get so caught up in sort of getting to the place. Oftentimes we are not starting where we were. So we are so caught up in getting to that point that we forget to celebrate and sort of honor the growth and honor the pathway that we've already been on. And what I really also want to tell them is that, allow yourself to own your leadership. It is not something that may feel comfortable in the beginning. Get comfortable with that discomfort. It is not prescribed. It is not cookie cutter. It is not linear. No two stories are going to look the same, and that is fine. And that is where your power and your strength is. So own your voice, own your narrative, and own your leadership, and allow yourself to get comfortable with the uncomfortable. We often are, hearing stories of resiliency, of contributions, of competence. Celebrate these stories. Celebrate these stories with other women also. Bring other women into the fold of the conversation. You come across a particular posting, you come across a job, an opportunity, a nomination for an award, and you think somebody in the community, in your network, in your peers is deserving, is someone who should be out there or who should get this opportunity. Share it. Take it forward. I think culturally, as a society, we've just been so gatekeeping. Don't gatekeep. Open doors, and more doors will open for you, because we need to do this as a collective. I think for IWI, a community is not a backdrop. Community is the leadership model. And that's what I want to emphasize for everybody, that own that leadership in you and run with it. Don't wait for anybody to notice or to celebrate you.
Thank you, Tina and Prachi. I really want to thank you both. The nuggets that you have shared around the owning it and the co-creating it and being uncomfortable are really important. So thank you again for really taking the time to create this beautiful, wonderful community that's giving back and is very reciprocal. So until next time.